All right, I think I'm going to go ahead and get started here. Thank you again for joining us. This is going to be a webinar about habitat restoration for birds, hosted by the Missouri River Bird Observatory with guest panelists from the National Wild Turkey Federation and Pheasants Forever, Quail Forever. So before I get started and go too far, I'm going to explain who we are as the Missouri River Bird Observatory. We are also known as MIRBO. We work to promote conservation of birds through scientific research, population monitoring, policy advocacy, education, and outreach. And our efforts fit into 4 overarching categories depicted in the eggs below of habitat, fittingly for this webinar, feeding the flock, bird-friendly communities, and getting people into nature. So with us, we have guest presenters today of Ethan Kleekamp. He's the private lands biologist for Pheasants Forever, Quail Forever. Tyler Cooper is an area forester with the National Wild Turkey Federation. And then Dana Ripper, who you were all getting emails from, may be joining around the Q&A section. She's one of our directors and founders of MIRBO. Ethan Duke is our other director and co-founder, and he will be talking about wetlands today. Lastly, my name is Zeb Yoko, and I'm the conservation science communicator with the Missouri River Bird Observatory. All right, so the webinar outline, I'll start off this presentation here and kind of host as we go through, which brings me to the technical notes about Zoom. So we're recording on Zoom as a webinar, so we can't see you as attendees, but we can get your feedback through the chat and Q&A functions. So on your screen, you should have a chat or a Q&A menu either at the top or the bottom of your screen. It doesn't show when I'm sharing them, so I can't show you exactly where they are. And they do differ a little bit by device, but we will take questions and answers at the end, but you can write them in the Q&A section as we go. So as you come up with something, you can put it there. You can use the chat function for technical details or other general comments. It's a lot easier for us if you use the Q&A for questions, so we can go through those in the actual Q&A section at the end. What else? So there's the raise hand function, which other presenters may have you use. I don't think I have any of that today, but basically the chat and the Q&A are going to be the biggest areas you may need in Zoom. And again, just a reminder, we can't see you guys, so you don't have to worry about that. Anything else I got to cover with that? So yeah, so I think that's all for the technical notes. I'll get now to the outline of what this webinar is going to contain. So I'm going to start off talking about habitat decline and its impact on birds and the importance of restoration. And then Ethan K is going to discuss conservation programs and techniques specifically on grassland areas. And then Tyler is going to talk more about management practices for woods, forest, and edge habitat. And then Ethan Duke will go over the wetland conservation programs. And then lastly, we will have that Q&A question and answer session. All right, so why the need for habitat restoration? Well, habitat loss is a major challenge for many species. Fragmentation from land conversion or agriculture or urbanization reduces abundance and diversity of native species. And you can see from this map of Missouri that grassland habitats are on one of the most imperiled systems. There's less than 4% remains in North America. As you can see, Missouri has very similar metrics, very little prairie left in Missouri. And then actually globally, grasslands have declined by about 45%. So there's lots of reasons why there's lots of just landscape change causing habitat loss. And additionally, fragmentation, which is the where good quality patches of habitat exist, but in a really patchy distribution, so they're not very near each other, is a major challenge for many species, and perhaps none worse than the greater prairie chicken, which is pictured here, who prefer huge swaths of treeless landscape. And of course, as many of you may know, I'm sure many of you know, and you can see from that map that not all of Missouri is or was prairie. There are many different, there are many diverse ecoregions which harbor different environments, such as prairie, forests, and wetlands, and they all occur in different amounts in these different ecoregions. And all these different delineations of different habitat and ecoregion classifications show that there's slight differences that can occur in communities of plants and animals, even in a forest versus in one area down here versus one area up here. There's slight differences that can occur across environments. So there are many different habitats in Missouri that are worth restoring, I guess is what I'm trying to get at there. And another unfortunate addition to reductions in habitat and fragmentation are environmental degradation, which creates additional challenges for species. So when habitat that looks like it's good quality or habitat that is still on the landscape but has lost its quality, such as different impacts that can affect forest quality, these do affect the birds and animals and other species in the community as well. Tyler will talk more in depth about this issue in particular. My background is more in the prairie, so I really can't speak too much about the woodland stuff, so I will leave that to Tyler to talk about more. And then one thing that's really indicative are bird populations. So birds are really good indicators of environmental quality because they're really easy to see in relation to other animals in particular. A lot of animals are really secretive. Birds can be one of the first things people can actually see. And as a result, they are a good indicator that we do have steep declines in environmental quality in North America. This study was illustrated by a team of researchers affiliated with the Cornell Lab of Ornithology and can be found at 3billionbirds.org. All of these figures are from there. You see that grassland birds in particular are in steep decline. 3 out of 4 eastern meadowlarks have been lost since the 70s, which is 50 years ago now, which is a little bit mind-blowing. But grassland birds are in steep decline, and obviously if there's less habitat for them, that's a major factor. But you also see in general migratory birds, which in their nature use more than one habitat, are in decline. So there are overarching concerns with habitat loss and other factors that are affecting our birds. Another one that we won't talk about too much, I don't think, today, but another main concern is aerial insectivores. So these guys that eat bugs, and if we use pesticides and other things that spray bugs or spray to kill bugs, there aren't very many things for them to eat. So they've also been in steep decline, in addition to not having anywhere to, say, nest in a grassland area or in a nice wetland as pictured here. And then restoration builds resiliency. So it makes these birds more resilient in the future, and hopefully they'll be able to bounce back. And that's good because there are many projects that do attempt to mitigate these negative effects through restoration. Fortunately, many agencies, including nonprofits, state and federal governments, have programs that encourage environmental restoration. We will talk in depth about a lot of these and their impact for the remainder of this webinar. And another positive note is that restoration helps birds. Species do improve with restoration. Waterfowl in particular are one of the most notable ones. They've increased their populations over their long-term averages, much because of the restoration programs that are in effect. We've added a lot of wetland acreage. The Ducks Unlimited and other organizations have done a really good job of promoting wetland habitat to keep waterfowl on the landscape. Raptors have also enjoyed protection, and then woodpeckers have also seen increases. These are largely due to successful habitat restoration and legislation changes such as the Migratory Bird Treaty Act and the Endangered Species Act. And then a lot of the habitat restoration occurs through these NRCS conservation programs that my co-hosts are going to be talking about later. And actually with that, I'm going to pass it off to my co-hosts and let Ethan go from here.
Thank you, Zeb. I'm going to try to get my screen share figured out here real quick. How does that look, guys? Okay. Yeah, again, thank you, Zeb. Thank you, Zeb, and thank you, MRBO, for inviting me back. I had a ton of fun a couple weeks ago talking about quail restoration efforts, and so that is, of course, why I'm handling some of the prairie restoration discussion today. And I have precious few minutes. I could prattle on the whole time about some of our management techniques and restoration techniques, or just about some of the cost share programs that we use. But I'm going to try to split the time as evenly as I can and give a primer really on both of those things. And so hopefully you'll have lots of questions whenever I'm done. We'll try to answer as many of those as we can at the end. But otherwise, check us out at MissouriPFQF.org, and there'll be lots of resources for you there. And so Missouri Prairie, as Zeb kind of showed you, it once covered over 15 million acres in the state. And really it's characterized by really the lack of trees. And so it's a grassland dominated landscape. Our kind of official working definition is less than 10% of trees. And really the largest factors in keeping it as such were these historic disturbances like wildfires or Native American set fires, and native grazers like elk and bison, which were hugely important for keeping it as that herbaceous community and keeping woodies out. And so here's another look at kind of what Zeb had showed, but rather than just taking it all as one uniform type, prairie itself can really be broken down into lots of different subsets. And so when you look at some of the work that Paul Nelson did through the terrestrial natural communities of Missouri, you can see that we can really stratify all these different prairie types based on underlying soil types and moisture regimes. And we can even go further than this when we look at ecological site descriptions. And so you see this tremendous variation and lots of nuances. And so when we're talking about prairie restoration, and particularly for the landowners out there, knowing what you have or what you had and what you're trying to get back to is going to be really important. And so to give an example closer to home where I work in Ray County, we have here 7 different types of prairie in the county. And so you can see the lion's share of that on those broader ridges between those river valleys is the Loess upland prairie. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about mostly. But I use these ecological site descriptions a lot, mainly for trying to give landowners an idea of what sorts of disturbance intervals they should be using. Of course, kind of the wetter, more protected areas would have historically been burned less frequently, and that really shaped the way the communities looked. And so when we're talking Loess upland prairie, really an area, they're pretty exposed, drier climates, and so they historically likely burned every 1 to 3 years. And so that kept it with tall grass dominance and a high diversity of forbs as well. And so when you zoom out at a larger landscape scale, Loess upland prairie might look like this following recent fires, or the same prairie community type could look like this just based on how long that interval is. And so big thanks to Ethan Duke for sharing this graphic with me yesterday, showing that even within, in this case, Loess upland prairie, you have different birds, grassland birds, that really favor different ends of that woody cover spectrum. And so you'll see an environment more like this might really be more favorable for northern bobwhites, Bell's vireo, and Henslow sparrows, whereas dick sissels, upland sandpipers, and greater prairie chickens really prefer that more treeless landscape. And so considering that, based on what sort of specific objectives you have, could really dictate what kind of disturbance regime you try to recreate when you're trying to recreate prairie. And so today's Loess upland prairie, and really this goes for most of our prairie types, they look totally different. And so we're left asking ourselves, where do we even begin? And so we have places like on the left where it's seen severe tree and invasive herbaceous encroachment, some monocultures of fescue or brome, and then kind of the most dramatic conversion would be that monotypic row crop there on the right. And so I'm going to start there. And in these cases, replanting is going to be needed. After decades and centuries of intensive cultivation, we've really lost that seed bank of that historic prairie. And so this is a prime example of where something like the Conservation Reserve Program would be a good option. And so really anything with crop history, you should consider looking into this program. And to give you a quick primer on some of the jargon, you might have run into a wall of this if you started looking into CRP. And so this is administered by the Farm Service Agency. And there are really 2 types of CRP. You have the general sign-up and you have the continuous sign-up. And so under the general sign-up, that's when we're talking about whole fields, 40, 50, 100, 200 acre conversions. And that is a competitive process where there's an actual ranking procedure that I'll talk about here in a second. And then the continuous sign-up is really more of a marginal field edge type practice, and that's first come, first serve. The practices within CRP are really, tremendously diverse themselves. And so I'll talk a little bit about some of those. there are sign-up incentive payments, practice incentive payments, and soil rental rates. And so if you've heard of that, that changes with each farm bill, but the county will calculate the average cash rent value of farm ground in your county and then base their annual CRP payment off of that. And so like I said, with the general sign up, the eligibility, there are lots of exceptions to this, but in general, if the ground had been cropped 4 of 6 years leading up to the farm bill that we're working on at the moment, then you likely have the adequate crop history or you do have adequate crop history to get into the program. Like I said, there's lots of exceptions, and so it'd be worth visiting with your FSA office. If you are not in one of those highlighted counties, the only way you're going to get into this general CRP sign up is if it's highly erodible ground. And so areas where there are more concerns of erosion occurring is where they're going to prioritize some of these areas. If it is flatter lying ground and you are in one of these statewide wildlife priority zones, you could still get into this program. And so to give you an idea of some of this ranking, wildlife habitat benefits, water quality benefits, air quality, all these things, some of them you can influence based on what practice you want to sign up for, and some of them are kind of out of your control. But the national office will, once they close down the sign up period, they'll calculate a cutoff score to determine who gets in or who doesn't. And so some example practices related to our discussion today would be a CP25 or a rare and declining habitat. That varies across the state and country what is considered rare and declining. And here it is tallgrass prairie. And so folks who sign up for this practice through CRP are agreeing to plant yellow tag seed, which is seed that is certified Missouri source. And I think the seed mixes this go round have 7 or 8 species of native warm and cool season grasses and at least 20 species of forbs. Another one that we really like to push as quail biologists is the state acres for wildlife enhancement. And in this part of the country, that's really the northern bobwhite being the focus. And it would be a similar seed mix to the 25, probably less grass. And there is an allowance for food plots and for woody cover establishment. And then the last one on there is pollinator habitat, which is kind of a big incentive right now, which sometimes is all forbs, no grass. But those are kind of some of the general options that would at least give you a semblance of historic prairie. Under continuous, it's really, like I said, more of the buffers, like the CP33 habitat buffers for upland birds. And so these can be 30 to 120 feet wide, and that's established in native prairie type vegetation along the perimeter of your crop field. You can also do that same pollinator habitat I talked about under the continuous sign up. There is no acreage limit under the general, but under continuous, you can put up to 10% of your row crop ground into it, not to exceed 10 acres. And so if you don't get in under the general for whatever reason, pursuing continuous might be a good option. Another newer one is a prairie strips, which are same kind of composition as the CP33 buffers, but they can actually run through the middle of your field. And so to give you an idea on the way these CRP contracts work, they're typically 10 to 15 year contracts. You must install the practice within 12 months of signing the contract. Extensions are available if you have a lot of site prep that's needed to plant. And then cost share is available for that seed purchase, for the planting and site prep. And then you're going to be getting an annual payment based on that county soil rental rate for each of those 10 or 15 years of the contract. And so this is a really attractive program for folks that are taking ground out of production. And so the USDA is paying them because this conversion is in lieu of other income that they would have been receiving. And so when it comes to planting these prairie restorations, site prep is really going to be important. And so you can see there, if you have issues with something like Sericea, Lespedeza, a really nasty invasive, spending enough time to get that conversion under control is really important. If you're lucky enough to have something like bean stubble over there, you can plant right into that, and it's well on its way to becoming a good stand. When we put together these seed mixes, granted, if we were really wanting to recreate prairie, we would use mainly yellow tag seed, and we would want to see 50 or 60 species or more in some of these mixes. But this line up here gives you kind of the baseline for what a lot of these programs require. And that's at least 20 species of wildflower. And then you can see down the line some of those needs as I take a drink. And so when it comes to planting these seeds, we're really talking either broadcasting or drilling this seed. Broadcasting we require to be done during the dormant period, which is from November 16th to March 15th, or drilling with a no-till seed drill. And you really need a drill that's adapted for some of this light, fluffy seed. That can take place anywhere from November 16th to May 31st. And so depending on what kind of site prep you did, that's going to dictate whether you broadcast or drill your seed. And so the drill, for instance, can cut through quite a bit of residue. And so is a pretty good option if it's highly erodible and you are worried about burning it or tilling it or something like that. If you don't have that crop history, CRP is not going to work for you, but NRCS, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, does have some options available for you. And the two big ones we work with are the Environmental Quality Incentives Program and the Conservation Stewardship Program. And so EQIP here is much different than CRP in that it's not an annual payment type program. It's paying you one time to do a practice that you're interested in doing. It is competitive, so there is a ranking process, and that's going to be based on the perceived benefit that we as taxpayers essentially are going to get from your project. And so if you're taking something like highly erodible crop ground and putting it into diverse prairie habitat, that's going to rank a lot higher than someone who just wants to plant a few trees at their house. And so really EQIP is a big umbrella. You can do lots of different practices under it. And, NRCS works with a lot of row crop farmers to help figure out crop rotations or cover crop systems. They help with grazing systems. And really you can do a lot of mixing and matching with this program. To give you kind of a Ray County example, I had a producer come to me 2 years ago with this eroding bean field. There wasn't a CRP sign up going on at the time. And so we put in an EQIP application, and it was just for a one-time payment to convert this land to monarch or pollinator habitat. And we got approved because it ranked high, just given the scenario. And so year one, it looked something like this, which is really typical, lots of annual weeds. And this was just a month or two ago this year. And so you can see really dramatic difference. And so that's kind of a rule of thumb. If you're going to be recreating prairie from seed, it takes some time. And so expect this plot you see here to look quite a bit different the next 2 or 3 years. And it's going to take some management. It's going to take some patience. CSP is, again, quite a bit different, a totally different paradigm in how we do conservation planning, where that is going to be a whole farm assessment. And so if you're interested in CSP, you're likely someone who's already done a lot of really great stuff on your farm. And you're interested in maybe getting rewarded for doing all this stuff without previous cost share, and then wanting to take your stewardship to the next level. And so this shows you an example. This person wanted to maybe just do some pollinator habitat on one of their fields. We're still going to assess all the fields, and we set this criteria pretty high. And so you need to be a good steward to get into this program. But once you do, it's pretty heavily incentivized because you're going to be getting annual payments, much like CRP, this for 5 years. And then you're going to get paid for whatever types of practices you want to install on top of that. And so CSP is another route to go. Here we have a situation where we're not sure if reseeding is necessary or not. If there's not apparent widespread damage from row cropping, there's a chance that there's a native prairie seed bank or dormant rhizomes down underneath of that sod. And so there are definitely clues that you can follow. there are lots of hay fields in my area that are terraced, which is evidence of past row cropping. But some of the hard to reach places, they might be hiding some really awesome secrets. And that's the case with this farm in western Ray County, where it looks like an absolute mess. It's got cedar encroachment, autumn olive, persimmon, sericea. But when you look closely, it had lots of really kind of rare and some obligate prairie species like the downy gentian, the prairie clovers, and the wild indigo there. And so this was an example where we didn't really want to go in and spray it all out and start over, because these are all species that are really tough to recreate from seed. And so instead we opted to go the long way and use management to get back to that prairie ecosystem. And so because we weren't going to agree to killing it and seeding it, we actually didn't score high enough on this particular application for EQIP. And so we had to look to non-competitive options. And so the two that we work with here are the Missouri Department of Conservation's Landowner and Community Assistance Program, as well as Pheasant and Quail Forever's Habitat Challenge Grant, which is essentially partnering chapters with MDC to kind of leverage their funds and give us the opportunity to do lots of these kind of practices that don't really fit into other Farm Bill programs that well. And so in this instance, these landowners did some heavy timber clearing, cutting out all of the cedar and encroaching shrubs, some prescribed fire, follow-up sericea treatment. And then this is what we're seeing already this first year, a really tremendous response of native prairie vegetation. And so this is definitely an example of having some kind of professional assistance to look for those indicator plants and look at signs of past land use and help you determine whether going at that slower route of management is going to be better, or trying to get into one of these programs where you get to reseed and start anew. And so again, I encourage you guys to check us out at MissouriPFQF.org. You can see we're really spreading throughout the state. We have most of North Missouri covered, and so we love meeting with folks and helping walk them through this process. And so with that, I will turn it back over. Okay, there you go. And I believe it's Tyler's turn.
Yep. Thanks, Ethan. That's gonna be hard to follow, but I'll give it a go. So, can you all hear me all right? Yeah. Okay. Let's see if we can get this screen. All right. Can you guys all see that? All right. So my name's Tyler Cooper. Again, I appreciate you guys inviting me back, just like Ethan said. I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit. Yep.
We've got your notes screen showing.
Okay. All right.
Just heads up.
All right. Let's see. Dun, dun, dun. I'll do this. Last time it worked really good whenever I had it backwards. Dun, dun, dun.
Such a great, beautiful day today. Nice day to spend all day working on a presentation.
Yeah. Okay, we'll try this one more time and see how it works. Okay, well. Okay, can you see my notes again? Okay.
You're good. That was good.
Okay, well, we'll start over. Again, so my name's Tyler Cooper. I'm a area forester for the National Wild Turkey Federation, and we're partnered with the NRCS. I cover Northwest Missouri, and we have two other partner NWTF foresters that are located east, really southeast Missouri. So I'm going to talk to you guys about forest management and somewhat, the benefits to birds. I'll just start here. So I apologize for the blurriness of the slide on the bottom left, but it's the closest thing I could find. And this is early 19th century. You can see the difference from the left to the right, just some of the bigger major areas, the Boot Heel, you can see some major deforestation. And then up along the Missouri River on the west side. And there's a bunch of other areas that are not so easy to see, but deforestation has been a big thing. And I'm going to talk to you not so much about restoration as far as planting new forests, because it's a lot harder to do than some of these other practices like Ethan talked about on prairies, but really talk to you guys about the benefits of management to the forests you already have. Whether it's large tracts or small tracts. So there's 4, but typically 3 different types of forest that we talk about in Missouri, and that's a closed canopy forest, which is what we refer to as basically woods on average, closed canopy and open canopy woodlands, and I'll talk about the difference about those in a little bit, and savanna. There are some very, very few in southern Missouri plantations. We do have white pine, and we have some pine plantations, but I don't really talk about these here because it's not a very common thing on private land. So yes, so a closed canopy forest, like I said, it's what we typically call woods here, and a closed canopy forest has an overstory. It typically has 70% to 100% canopy cover. And it's got an overstory, mid-story, and then understory, and then it's got ground layer, ground vegetation. Because of this, it's the most diverse in plant species, or tree species, sorry, not plant species, tree species. So it's got a very diverse ecosystem that multiple species use. And I'm not talking about just birds, but even in the bird category, I'll show you guys a depiction later that kind of explains this. But some of the practices that you can do with closed canopy forests, so I'm just going to refer to them as forests from here on out, are the most diverse. TSI, which is timber stand improvement, and that's whenever your woods are overstocked, which this picture on the right you can see is there's a lot of timber in there, and that forest is overstocked. And what I mean is there's more trees than there should be, so the trees are over competing for nutrients and sunlight. Therefore, you're going to have poor quality timber, and you'll have less understory vegetation. So a TSI, timber stand improvement, there's a light, medium, and heavy thinnings, and that's basically depending on 1, your goal, and 2, how overstocked your canopy is. And then we have a crop tree release, which is another type, and that's actually exactly what it sounds like. So if you have a set, it's very typical here in northern Missouri, but a woodland or a forest that's got a few oaks scattered throughout and a few black walnut or other desirable trees. In some cases, they can even be, hickory. If everything else is honey locust or hedge or poor quality timber, you pick those good trees and you release them. So say there's a good white oak, you would thin around that tree to release it from competition and increase the growth rate on that. So another good thing that you can do in closed canopy forests, and this is more if you have a little bit larger scale, and I'm not talking thousands of acres, even 100 acres of timber, but group openings, essentially mini clear cuts is what they are. And those can be beneficial if in the same scenario, you have an area that's just really poor quality and poor species, but maybe on the edge of that area it's got some good quality species, and then you'll have seed crop for that. And that will also start an early successional forest, which, I'll talk about a little bit later, can benefit certain bird species. Also, you can do this in a woodland too, but typically it's in your forests. Edge feathering is a really good technique, and it's not so much a forest management technique, but it's a good habitat management technique, and that's really what we're talking about here. So if you do have native prairie or you're trying to reestablish warm season grass on the edge of a forest, you can do some edge feathering, which is simply dropping some trees with the tops into the edge of that field to create not such a rough edge. It'll create a gradual edge into the woods from transition. It'll give good escape cover, woody cover for quail and even turkey brood rearing habitat. So, and it's very, very simple to do because most trees lean out towards the edge, so they're pretty easy to fall. And then, so closed and open canopy woodlands. Like I said, really the main difference is almost like you can see in this picture. It's just a woodland is described as 30% to 70% canopy cover. An open canopy woodland is roughly 30 to 50%, and a closed canopy is roughly 50 to 70%. The management is identical for these two woodlands. Typically, and almost specifically, fire is the best tool to manage woodlands. What makes a woodland so nice is you can see in these pictures, especially the one on the right, it's a little bit better picture, but it's got a really good herbaceous layer underneath native vegetation. A lot of times when you have a good maintained woodland, you'll have forbs, grasses, and depending on when and how often you burn it, you can have different outcomes, like Ethan discussed earlier. If you have shorter burn intervals, you'll have almost no woody cover underneath, but you'll have a really good stand of native forbs and grasses. If you burn earlier in the year, and when I say earlier, roughly February to early March, it's going to benefit your forbs more than your grasses. And if you burn later, so late March to early April, your forbs will be started, so it'll kind of knock them back and it'll favor grasses. So savanna is the third type, which is much like a woodland, but it's a lot less canopy cover. It's less than 30. I've always been told and kind of live by that if you're looking for shade, you're probably in a savanna, and if you can find shade pretty easily, you're in a woodland. That's a really easy way to kind of just ballpark it. This is a really good picture, actually, other than it's slightly blurry, which I apologize for. But again, they're typically found on kind of the edge of prairie habitat and in between the transition between prairie and forest or prairie and woodland, mostly on the west side of the state here in Missouri, but not 100%. Management, again, is fire. You actually pretty well management, just like a prairie. Try to have not so super high intensity fires to where you'll girdle those trees with heat, but typically the species that are found in both these savannas and woodlands are white oak, post oak, blackjack oak in southern Missouri, black oak, and chinkapin oak, and they're all pretty fire tolerant. So that's the difference between the three. Again, with the woodlands, with the woodlands and savannas, sorry, but Ethan talked about the ecological site description on trying to figure out what specific species were there in the past for the different prairie types. And that's another really good thing that I actually didn't have in here, so I'm glad that you mentioned it, Ethan, is looking at your site description and your soils that you have can really establish even in the history. So say there's no trees there, or the opposite, it's 100% closed canopy forest and it was historically savanna, it's probably not too difficult to get back. And if you again have no trees and say it is a crop field, I won't say easy by any means, it'll take a lot of work, but fairly simple to reestablish because it's not a hard, heavy tree planting. It's pretty sparse. And then, the native forbs and grasses reseeding is probably the biggest work you're going to have. So, all right. So I talked about prescribed fire, and so did Ethan, but some of the reasons it can benefit in all three of these forest types is a lot of people are afraid to do prescribed fire in forests because they have quality timber. And if you do a low and slow burn, which just means low intensity, relatively high humidity for your burn, it won't really harm those trees. So as long as you know what you're doing, and there's plenty of information out there, and to speak to me or Ethan or any of these guys, I'm sure have experience with prescribed fire, would be more than happy to help you out. But it can reduce non-fire tolerant species. Said that right? So fire intolerant species, however you'd like to say it, such as ironwood is a big one up here in northwest Missouri, well, northern Missouri in general, not just northwest. And typically it wasn't fire tolerant. So in the past, we had common enough fires that it was present but never an issue. and now it will overtake understories and create no new regrowth, eliminate hardwood regeneration. So fire is a good way to get a handle on that, as well as TSI. Like I have here, it promotes native regrowth. So that's one of the biggest keys in savannas and woodlands is this fire, just really kind of knocking back those woody species and the woody encroachment and allowing that native regeneration to come in. So here, why is all this management matter? This is specifically kind of wildlife oriented. So a lot of people don't understand or don't realize that I deal with a lot of landowners that want to just strictly work with timber quality and just wildlife, and really management for both of those is equally important and almost no difference, because if you grow good quality timber with appropriate stocking, you're going to have more mass production. And when I'm saying mass, I'm talking acorns, hickory nuts, walnuts, etc. Which for a bunch of songbirds is not super important, but game birds such as the wild turkey feed heavily on acorns, especially early spring. And then again, getting these invasives out is one of the biggest things that we deal with. This picture here in the bottom left is bush honeysuckle. And you can see just from that picture how thick it is that there's no understory underneath of it. So there's no natives. And again, autumn olive is that middle picture I have. It's more of an edge species, but it will definitely get in and overtake the understory as well. This picture I have on the right is a before and after ironwood removal, TSI. And you can see and I realize it's leaf off, but you can see the difference pretty easily. So all that new space is going to be more sunlight to get to the ground and more forage for all sorts of species, and just be a better habitat. Again, ironwood is native, but it gets so dense now without fire that it almost becomes invasive. Excuse me. Another thing I didn't talk about whenever I talked about TSI earlier, but one of the biggest things the biggest ways that we do TSI is what's called girdling. And that's, you leave the tree standing and you basically ring it with a chainsaw, and that creates that tree that turns into a snag, or it can even be a cavity tree. So create nesting habitat for all sorts of different birds, and it can be den trees for other wildlife. So that's another big thing about TSI. So you're reducing the competition for your forest and creating habitat all at the same time. So my next few slides are just kind of different birds that use these different type of forests. At the very beginning, I talked about those different canopy levels in the closed canopy forest, which is what we refer to as forest. And this depiction here just kind of shows you the different canopies and what different species use that. And on the right side of the screen here, I talked a little bit about those group openings, or what I call, mini clear cuts, and the early successional stages. And these three species here all were shown in a study that the first 5 years of that early successional after clear cut, they spent majority of their time there, while in Missouri, obviously. But so having this diverse habitat throughout your woods is not only, one, good for the woods, like I said, but it creates so much more habitat for different species that use all these different niches. One thing I will mention, if you have any desire to do any of these practices that I've already covered, like Ethan talked about, that EQIP, CSP, and MDC, and even the QF grants, all are available for a cost share for these different practices. Another thing with these clear cuts is, if you were to implement them, preferably do them in almost odd shapes or rounded edges, and that creates less of a hard edge for the habitat, kind of how I discussed an edge feathering. And you could even, if you really wanted to get crazy with it, you could edge feather your edges to create that soft edge, as we like to call it. So woodlands, again, these next few slides are just some different birds that use woodlands. The painted bunting I have on here, it's more southeast Missouri and in glade habitat, which kind of reminds me, I did skip over glades, which can be a group opening restoration area that you could have an overgrown glade. in your forests. They're more common south of the river, but they are definitely still prevalent north of the river, and I-70 is basically what I'm talking about here. But they are dry, rocky habitats that are in the middle of your woods. And if you don't know what a glade is, if there's a spot in your woods that you see that's kind of open, probably overgrown with some cedars, and has flowers in the summertime, odds are it's probably a glade. And they are really cool, neat habitat. But anyways, kind of got on a rant there. So these are different species. Again, one that I mean is really generalist species that uses all three of these are red-headed woodpeckers. Actually, almost all the woodpeckers. But next thing I have here is savanna, and these species kind of, I say they go back and forth. I mean, savanna is, like I said, it's basically a prairie with scattered trees throughout. So they're not 100% specific to these savanna types, but these are probably some of the most common birds we have here in Missouri that like the savanna atmosphere per se. The American kestrel is very common in prairies too, so that one's not specifically savanna-y, but yeah. So here's a picture of a glade. I thought I had one on here. So it's going, again, they usually have rocky outcropping, some native forbs in there. And typically they're overgrown with cedar, but that's something that we have cost share available to get rid of. And questions at the end, and I appreciate you guys having me on. I'll turn it over to Ethan. Maybe.
Yep,
Okay.
yep. Thank you. I see some questions that are piling up in the Q&A for us to hit the end here. I will go jump and share my screen out. Just take me a second here. I'm also going to do a share my computer sound because I have one sound thing. And then one more advanced screen sharing. I'll be right there. Okay.
And I'll say, while Ethan's doing that, we try to stick to these about an hour. We're going to go a little over, it looks like, which is not a problem. And then we'll stick around for questions as long as there are questions rolling in. But feel free to duck out if it does get to 6:30 after Ethan's done talking. But please wait till he's done at least.
I can go pretty quickly. Can anybody hear me and see my slides okay? Is that a thing? Good deal. I can see you guys. So my section is talking about wetlands, habitat, and restoration a little bit. And it really doesn't matter, you know, the size or scale. It could be a little pond in your yard. And I saw a question pop in earlier about size and scale. We can definitely address those smaller things. But wetlands are just so important, and they're so fascinating. Like these other habitats, we've lost quite a bit of them. But we are making strides, and our typical threats to the wetland habitats aren't quite the same in recent years. We're seeing a lot more loss to development and other things than the typical land use changes that we've seen. So I'm going to jump over here and just show you a picture of, this was the mess on our property. Okay, there's like cedar, honeysuckle, Japanese honeysuckle, bush honeysuckle. And I just sat out there and basically hand removed it all very carefully because there's a lot of poison ivy in there. And just for that little pond, and just completely opened that up. And I should have ran down today and gotten a picture, but that's like a bunch of natives have come back in there now, and it's full of jewelweed, and even though it's not a super great native, it's way better than what it was, and some other neat native plants are in there, and that's in the edge there, sort of feathering out into a grassland. So so that little difference there is already changing that ecology of that little pond in this little tiny small scale, and we can already see improvements in the water in it as well. And if you think of this on a large scale, wetlands are actually like the kidneys of our landscape. They can mitigate climate change, and they are habitat for biodiversity. And it's really important to see it in that sort of big picture and in the local perspective. And so if we want to think about how you can restore wetlands in Missouri, well, let's understand them first and understand how they can fit in and deal with things like climate, how they help with clean water, all the economic connections that we have with them, it really benefits to do everything we can from the small scale all the way up. So wetland processes, so I just described them as sponges and kidneys. That's typically what people use as words to describe them. Here's a neat little graphic to sort of show you. This actually came from Ducks Unlimited. So you can see intact wetlands and up here, and you can see historically effective drainage area, little white lines there. And then if you see if the wetlands are drained out, you don't have that sponge kidney thing going on. And the new effective drainage area just really changes. And we've seen that happen in the last couple of years, not only because of increased rainfall, but because of these loss of wetlands, and that affects everything downstream through the watershed. Speaking of watersheds, you could actually find this in a couple locations, but wherever you are, you can look up for your watersheds. Here's a watershed inventory at the Missouri Department of Conservation, so you can actually look up what watershed you live in, and you can sort of zoom in from there, and you can think of all the little practices that are going in on the ground everywhere and how they're impacting and improving things throughout each of those watersheds. Here's an example where that is not happening super well. This is Missouri's Boot Heel region. You see those several main ditches drain the entire boot heel. And you can imagine the problems that creates and what happens downstream. Fortunately, Ducks Unlimited, Missouri Department of Conservation, NRCS, USDA, a lot of other programs are helping rebuild the wetlands in these areas that are contiguous to these major drainages and helping out. But we have a long way to go. And if you look at this scale and you say, wow, that's the whole boot heel. Well, think about this on a massive global scale. And so what's happening now is all these watersheds are pouring down, and we're losing all of this sediment and things, and all this extra fertilizer and things are going out into the Gulf and creating dead zones. And we know about the dead zone in the Gulf, but it's happening everywhere around our coast, and now it's spreading out deeper into the oceans. And it's something we have to get a handle on really quickly. To get into these wetland zones and start thinking about how these things are functional on a smaller scale, we start thinking about wetland terms. And these, Ethan and Tyler brought up different terms for different habitat types within their communities. And there's these natural communities within wetlands. And a lot of people use these different types pretty generically because it's a good way to describe it. And this is a good little graphic. It says you have upland, shrub, meadow, wet meadow, emergent, and aquatic. Well, you can actually get shrub in the middle of the wetland. And you can have a shrub, swamp, wetland. So this simplifies it, but it's those factors that you want to consider when you're looking at trying to manage a wetland habitat, whether you just have a little bit of wet meadow or not. And also, if you can think about this graph and think about bird species occupying all of this, many bird species like rails may want shallow water all the way up into the wetlands, up to the wet prairie, into a little bit of upland. So managing that gradation is really important. And also understanding it not in this simple two-dimensional aspect, but looking at it a three-dimensional aspect. Imagine these hummocks going throughout the wetland. So as the water level goes up and down, it actually creates a lot of micro topography and a lot of micro habitats in different areas of shallow water or deeper water, heterogeneously mixed out throughout the wetland. So let's look at a few of these types right away and the kind of birds that really like them. And so here's a seasonal wetland. They typically hold water, well into the fall and in the spring, and they kind of dry up in summer. We see this sometimes because things are not drained properly. They're manipulated to drain that way. Sometimes it's natural occurrence because of sandy soils. But there's a lot of birds that like this kind of seasonal wetland, like this beautiful Virginia rail. They're a big rail. They use these seasonal wetlands as they migrate through Missouri every year in good number. We also have these great snipe, the cousin of the American woodcock, but they like typically to be out in the kind of the muddy areas when it's drying up. And this little picture in the background, I can't tell you how many snipe we kick up in that type of habitat. Just a little bit of mud, a little bit of veg, and it's draining down, and the snipe are everywhere, and they love it, probing down there for those invertebrates. And then when it dries out, oftentimes these wetlands become good habitat for our grassland birds, like this beautiful dick thistle. This happens so commonly. I think wetlands can be undervalued. we have a good friend in conservation. His name's Max Alliger, and he said, wetlands are just prairies with water. And he kind of has a good point with that one, I think. The next type of habitat would be emergent marsh. And emergent marsh, you can think of it as more semi-permanent, kind of flooded wetland areas, stem plants like reeds and sedges and smartweed, but they provide a lot of habitat for a lot more like amphibians and reptiles and, you know, critters like muskrats and big wading birds and just a lot of wildlife love it. And you get more of the kind of the chance for perennial vegetation, which don't produce as many seeds as the annual vegetation, but I think we oftentimes don't have enough of that sort of old primitive perennial wetland vegetation that emergent marshes can bring about. And maybe that's why we have less critters like this here. Maybe we have 12 breeding pairs left of king rails in the state. Nobody really knows for sure, but not very many of them. These guys love crustaceans like crayfish, and maybe that might be another part of that more permanent wetland ecosystem where they have a lot more abundances of crayfish where they receive less disturbance, which may affect those types of populations. Just an idea out there. But if you're in a good situation, you may have an emergent marsh like this, or be able to go bird at one or go to enjoy one. You can start looking at it from this perspective. Maybe that wetland has a different type of wetland component to it, and only a section of it's an emergent marsh. And that's the ideal situation where you have something for everybody throughout the year. But if you have something like this, here's a video that one of our wetland technicians came up with. That's the king rail. It's basically like the prairie chicken of the wetlands, you know, and it's a really special thing to be able to have the opportunity to see. Here's a beautiful scrub. I know this one just a couple counties north. I've seen least bitterns pitched in here. I've seen Sora standing in some of the branches of this type of habitat. These least bittern typically like button bushes, which is a wetland shrub basically, and similar things like that. And they're semi-colonial. So sometimes having that shrub area is really great. I know that Tyler mentioned it earlier about the successional habitats and the importance to a lot of bird species. And that's certainly true within wetlands too. Even if it's permanently, say, a ring of buttonbush or a ring of cattails around an area, you still have that sort of successional like structure that's really important for certain niches of birds. So I think, was that my last slide? That was my last slide because I'm making it quick. So I think I wanted to cover forested swamp actually. We'll get back to my question slide. Forested swamp is another one. We've lost, all but 12% of this habitat in Missouri, usually associated with river habitats. If you have some of this, you're really fortunate, or if you can have access to some of this, you're really fortunate. Because usually in that ecosystem, you don't have to do a ton of management. There is some good timber management practices can happen, like Tyler was talking about, of releasing, particular for good stands of oaks and whatnot. But when you have that, you're going to have these great wetland associated birds that require that, like this beautiful prothonotary warbler, prothonotory warbler, and these Swainson's warbler, which are primarily found in the boot heel. That are associated somewhat with cane thickets as well, but they've been seen in northern Missouri too. It's just another bird we're kind of concerned about because the rareness of that particular habitat as well, at least in Missouri. And then I'll pick up one more of these wetland habitats, which is a fen. And so you can think of it as sort of a bog, but this is where the water comes up from beneath. It's not fed by like a typical spring source, and it's cool year round. So it provides a lot of good cool, clean water for the plant community, the invertebrate community, and everything else. And it helps sustain this good little sedgy kind of habitat year round, which can be it's really, really quite rare and similar to the prairie swale. But you'll get birds like this sedge wren, which is really interesting. And they're always looking for these kind of ephemeral habitats that pop up. And they never find the same place every year because these things aren't easy to find. It's a unique bird. So we can look at these wetlands a little bit more carefully with our bird data that we collect and really see, like this graphic here is showing gill distribution. So this is showing on one thing, waterfowl, water birds, like waders and things, and then marsh birds, you know, the shorter waders kind of thing, and the more uplandy wet prairie birds. And we can really see how they're using these habitats and being distributed throughout the niches and the microhabitats, and depending on water level and vegetation within these sites. And we can also look at wetlands from the perspective of how these change over time. You know, there's challenges associated with all these habitats that Tyler and Ethan mentioned earlier, especially with forest communities. You know, forest grows so slowly. It's just almost a completely different philosophy of time and management, where prairies can respond really dynamically pretty quickly, but it's still going to take a few years to get really established and really see it express itself if it's a reconstruction or whatnot. But with wetlands, all these conditions every year really affect them, and they can be completely dynamic. So here's waterfowl over several years in that upper right corner. That wasn't a year that this particular wetland was surveyed, but you can see there's subtle shifts in how waterfowl might use that particular wetland. So when you're managing for these things, you have to think of space and time. You have to think of dynamics of topography and a host of other things. Zeb is going to include a link to a lot of these resources, by the way, but I just wanted to show you wetland management at the MDC. They have a great website there. We have links that we'll provide. In that section, they cover a lot of things from all these different habitats, including wetland improvements and things. The other things that they have associated with that website are charts of maybe your targets and things you might have to deal with, and water management regimes that really help break it down and help you get your mind around what you might have to do to maintain that type of habitat. The USDA NRCS has these programs similar to the ones that Ethan was discussing earlier, and there's a slew of them, and we have a lot of great resources of people to help you, and their website's pretty helpful to point you in a different direction describing those programs, eligibility, that type of thing. And in Missouri, we have wetland emphasis teams. They're dual positioned Missouri Department of Conservation and NRCS people, and they're stationed in soil and water conservation areas or whatnot, offices throughout the state. And they can, they're responsible for very large areas, but these are the go-to wetland gurus for the state agencies. And they work hand in hand with engineers, and they just do amazing things. So those resources are all there. We're gonna provide some more links for you later. And now I'll jump back to my thank you slide and ask for some questions. And hopefully I got through that quick enough so we didn't, there we go. So we didn't waste too much time.
Awesome. Yeah, that was the fastest I think I've ever heard you talk, Ethan. So hopefully we could get through it. But yeah, that was really good information again, too. And I really do want to thank all of our co-panelists, co-hosts, and presenters today for joining us and talking about this, which is definitely their expertise. We as Merbo don't have land of our own that we do a lot of this stuff on. So they're the most informed, and then they know all of the jargon and with all the practices and really the abilities to help you guys sign up for these programs and learn how to implement these actions. So without any further ado, I'm going to jump to the questions, and actually I'm going to go slightly out of order because there's one question I've got that I think can be addressed really quickly by Ethan, and that was somebody was wondering who your bird friend is on the back of your chair.
He's still there.
Yes.
That is the green stinking bird, the green bird. He is actually a green cheek conure, and he is a character, but that's the green bird. Yep. Just he's dastardly, so.
All right, and then with that, Ethan, do you want to stop sharing your screen so we can do the gallery view for the rest of the questions? Perfect. All right, so I put some of those links in the chats already. I will finish out the ones that I've been given as we go. But the first question was, Would biomagnification and cats be a cause of bird decline in the USA and Missouri? Short answer, yes. Long answer, yes, there are lots of things that lead to bird decline. And I don't think we want to spend too much time on that because there's more questions that'll be better served by our panelists. So I will type in the chat actually for that one, the Cornell, that 3billionbirds.org site that lists and has videos on all the different reasons for decline. So I think we'll let that address that one. Unless there's anybody that really needs to get their 2 cents in while we're here. Okay, see lots of heads shaking, so we will move on to the next one. And this one is about enrolling land that doesn't necessarily have a crop history. For example, they're talking about interested in turning their front yard, which is about 1/3 of an acre into native prairie, and from what it's various types of grass now. And are there any other programs for this person? CRP, I'm pretty sure, is out, but there may be other options. One thing we have is our Landscaping for Birds webinar from last week that may address some of that for doing it on your own, but I will let Ethan and Tyler talk about any potential programs.
Yeah, that sounds like one. You wouldn't be eligible for CRP. You would probably be eligible for EQIP or CSP, but you would most likely not rank high enough to get any funding to do that practice. And so you would really be wanting to pursue one of the non-competitive cost share options. And so that's an example of, and Tyler, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you could pursue the Conservation Department's Landowner and Community Assistance Program for that. I know in some of our cost share programs, we go as low as 1/10 of an acre when we plan practices. And so, yeah, it would be important to not have to compete against other folks who are wanting to put in, many tens or hundreds of acres. And so, yeah, I would check out MDC's resources, and then depending on the part of the state that you're in, the Habitat Challenge grant from the Pheasants Forever and Quail Forever paired with MDC might be willing to help you with that project too. And so, especially towards the end of the fiscal year, if they haven't spent all their money on really quail focused projects and they're wanting to get it off the books, then they might look to do little projects like that. Good question though.
Yeah, that's a great question and a great answer. I didn't know there was anything for smaller plots that aren't generally farmed, so good to know.
I'll just add really quickly that the Missouri Prairie Foundation, typically their grant programs you need to have sort of a community education component. But if you're talking about a front yard, depending on where you live, something like that might qualify, and they'll help with a little bit of funding to do exactly the sort of size acreage that you were asking about.
Awesome.
Yeah, always look into local programs like master naturalist groups that might be helpful to have more hands on deck, just volunteer hands to come help you out, and people love doing that kind of thing. And everybody just sort of take turns on what component they want to do, or maybe somebody can point you in the right direction to find good local plant resources as well.
Awesome. Yeah, so lots of resources. We really want you to have a way to put native plants back on the landscape. So there are plenty of options out there for you. The next question is from Ethan K's presentation, talking about the year 2 photo that showed lots of black-eyed Susan and coneflower and monarchs. And that was a beautiful photo. The question was, shouldn't we be seeing milkweed in that picture?
Yes, I wish I would have had time to show more pictures, but if in that walkabout, there was quite a bit of butterfly milkweed coming up. And that's something I could just say anecdotally that I've seen, is that the butterfly milkweed has higher germination rate than the common milkweed. And so it's kind of frustrating because the road ditches along where we do these plantings are full of common milkweed, and they just take forever to show up in our plantings. And so that's kind of frustrating, but there's definitely quite a bit of milkweed in that plot. You just couldn't see it in that photo. But for those seed mixes for monarch specific programs, we require that at least 3% of the seed be milkweed seed. And so kind of the generic recommendations are that on upland sites, that is composed of common milkweed and butterfly milkweed, and then in low-lying sites, swamp milkweed and common milkweed. And so there's a lot out there, but you're right on target. We really want to see lots of milkweed stems in those plantings to really get the benefit.
I will add to that well, the butterfly milkweed's generally shorter than some of the coneflowers, so that might be why it didn't show up quite as much. And then also the black-eyed Susan and coneflower are nectar resources for the adult monarchs. So monarchs, the caterpillars will definitely need the milkweeds to eat, but the adult butterflies can use any flower that has a nectar resource or pollen to feed on too. So they also do provide some resources for monarchs as well. I saw somebody raise their hand in the participants list, so feel free. You can type in the question and answer box or button if you do have a question that you wanted to ask with that. It may have been a finger fumbling thing or something, but I will move on to our next question here. For grassland habitat and the others, you hear about burning during the growing season. This is also the nesting season for ground nesting birds. So what is best? And that will be a lively debate that I will not start.
I think that's a really excellent question, and one of the first that I had when I started this job. And so I would say kind of the best advice I could give you is to implement some kind of rotation whenever you're managing your fields. And so there's absolutely going to be some kind of collateral damage, just like there was historically. I mean, wildfires, and especially in ecology, we would refer to that as a stochastic event. So something that happens kind of random and kind of all over different times of year, different scales. And you'll hear a lot with some managers nowadays talking about kind of chaos theory, introducing some chaos. And so folks that burn their field the same time every single year, for CRP, a lot of the times that's March, you start to see that vegetative community starts to simplify because you're promoting the same suite of species each time you do that. And so by staggering the times that we're burning can really help diversify the plants that we see. And so doing a rotation is going to be really important. And so never burn, I would say, more than half. I would rather it be like a third or just a fourth at a time, and then stagger throughout the year when you're burning. Growing season burns also are going to be less complete than dormant season burns. The fuel moisture is higher, and so it's going to be a patchy, kind of incomplete burn. And so there'll be islands of habitat out there that survived the burn in that unit, and so that could be a way some of those breeding birds survive just in that particular unit. Of course, you're not touching these other units at that time, but yeah, that's a really, really terrific question. I would say only burn a plot if it's about to exit the habitat type preferred by the species you're managing for. And so that's kind of wordy, but for quail, for instance, they might overwinter in 3, 4, 5 year rough that's gotten pretty grassy and woody. But the research out of that Southwest Missouri quail study was showing, 12 to 18 months post-burn, those birds aren't really using that habitat much for nesting. And so if, say, in this instance, quail is something you're managing for, burning it when it no longer looks like what you want it to look like or what the birds want it to look like, you don't really run as great of a risk of hurting those populations because they're just not in there right then. Excellent question, though. I'm sure other folks might have other stuff to say, but yeah, that's a really great question.
Not sure anybody's going to debate that. I think Ethan just put the debate that I also thought was going to ensue to rest. That was a very comprehensive answer.
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah, so we will move on to the next question. I think, yeah, that perfectly covered every angle of it. It's a thing that exists. Okay, next question. I also have woods and found the forest canopy savanna section really interesting, so it's good to hear. I have a very varied piece of land on 3-ish acres that includes a lot of different habitats and small sections. So and then the question is, do you offer consultation with your organization in Iowa? I think this is the same person that said they're in the Loess Hills, so they might be on the state boundary. So I think that's for Tyler.
Yeah. So, yes, we do. And we have, and also I'm sure, Ethan, you guys have a QF biologist in Iowa that could also help if it's not strictly forested, or even if it is. But we do have, I think we have 2 foresters up there. And I did kind of forget to mention at the end of my presentation that there's consulting foresters, or private foresters can also help with all these management objectives. I would be more than happy to talk to you and see if we can figure something out and get you in touch with someone. And in Missouri, you know, in the MDC offices have foresters within certain counties that are also able to come out and help with this. And between me and the other NWTF foresters and the MDC foresters, you know, it's a cost free for site visits and stuff like that. But the consultants also do this for a living, and they're very good at what they do. And they're all throughout the state of Missouri. And I would be more than happy to get you a list of all the consulting foresters as well. So, but we do offer that. We have, like I said, we have foresters in several different states, and there's DNR foresters in Iowa that would also be willing to help with this stuff. So.
Awesome. And I'm adding Tyler and Ethan's contact information to the chat right now. Maybe I missed it during your talk, Tyler, but when do they do the burns for forest management typically? I think I
typically, and kind of Ethan hit the nail on the head there. You know, we get caught up in a regime of doing it in late February to early April, anywhere within that. Basically, because if you do it later than April, and sometimes it is your goal, you know, to take out those woody and those younger saplings and stuff like that, especially in a woodland. The sap flow's already started, and it's really easy to kill those trees. In an actual forest, if you're doing a forest burn, I don't recommend doing it much later than, you know, green up typically, which varies, but is usually in April at some point in time. Just because if you are inexperienced, it can be easy to get a pretty hot fire, and you can girdle some trees. And if you don't exactly, you know, feel really confident, there can be snags and stuff like that you catch on fire that are a lot easier whenever the conditions are wrong. So typically we burn, you know, even woodlands, but from, like I said, late February to early April. But you can have beneficial burns in the fall as well. I just, in certain areas, I try to steer clear of that, just because you're going to get a lot of your residue on the ground being gone after a burn. So it can create some erosion problems, but if you don't have any severe slopes or anything like that, it can be very beneficial. Like Ethan said, give you a variety of species. So, but we typically, almost everyone I know, burns early spring. So.
Okay. And that actually leads perfectly into the next question, which is, besides oaks, what are some of the most fire-resistant trees? And they were particularly wondering about pecans.
I wouldn't say pecan are fire tolerant. Most big mature trees can be fire tolerant because they develop pretty thick bark, but oaks are by far the most tolerant. There's some hickory species, but as far as a good list of some, I really don't have many. Typically in these woodlands and savannas, what you see are oak species. If any of you guys from historically know of anything else, I'd be more than happy to hear from you. But we almost always manage for oaks, which sometimes I feel bad about because we get species specific, but historically that's what we had up in these savannas and woodland type habitat. And even in the understory, you know, if you have a side-by-side comparison of stuff that's burned and stuff that's not, it's almost 90% oaks that's been historically burned. So I don't have a great answer for you, but hopefully Ethan's got something.
I've got another question for you, Tyler.
All right.
Because I'm thinking about this the same way that person is. And say I'm growing, like I have a savanna now, and so I plant some oaks and maybe some other stuff just to see what happens. And they're spread out, and I've got a grass community underneath it that I want to burn every year. How do I save those little trees I mean, I don't even know if little bur oaks would be super fire resistant or not.
Yeah.
Especially if I got a good fuel load in my grasses because they haven't grown up enough yet. So,
Definitely. And
how do we protect them?
so that's one of the biggest challenges in reestablishing both woodlands and savannas whenever you're not starting out with any timber. And basically, we recommend trying to wait till those trees are at least 3 inches in diameter. If you can't, because obviously that's going to be a long time. When they're open grown, if the soil quality is okay, it won't be super long, but still probably be at a minimum of 5 years, and that's stretching it. The best thing you could do would be mow, I mean, essentially make miniature fire lines around those trees. So just mow, since especially in a savanna setting, you have such few trees, it's going to be more work, but you could mow, a 10-foot swath around those. And even depending on how your fire's set up, obviously you can back burn around that. But if it's going to be super hot and you're not going to want to be in there, just for safety reasons, just burn a big or mow a big line around it. Or you can even, you can do it's not hard if the conditions are good and you don't have a lot of wind, you can make a small patch burn around it that you can control and put out prior to your burn. It's the same principle as short mowing though, but that's really the best way to do it.
Awesome. Yeah, I was gonna, what your question you asked, Tyler, I was just gonna add on, like, I am by no means a forestry expert, but I always hear like the oak hickory is like the combination of the trees you see around here, which pecans are in that family. And I typically think, and I don't know if this is true or not, but I think of pecans being in like the lower or the wetter areas, which may
Yes.
help preserve them from burning too.
Right, and they typically are a bottomland species, and they prefer moist sites. So fire's not a big thing that they're historically prone to. So.
Right. So they're not used to it, but you might be able to avoid burning them if you're doing a burn at least.
Right. Yes. Preferably, like I said, more mature species, just because they have that thicker bark.
Perfect. Awesome. All right. So we've got one question left. So unless anybody has some questions they want to get in really quickly, we will end after this one. This is asking if we're seeing more farmers switching to using prairie strips or wetlands now that there's been massive flooding in 2011 and 2019 along the Missouri River. So that is a great question.
I'll start off in my area. So I cover a 3-county area just northeast of Kansas City. Haven't seen any prairie strips yet. That's a brand new practice. I think this year was the first time that they rolled that out. Other parts of the country, perhaps, but we're still yet to see that. As far as some of the wetland practices, I think, yes. I know this year we have just four or five in Ray County that are pursuing continuous CRP. The CP23s are the wetland practices in areas that keep getting inundated. I have some other folks who are doing, and it's amounting to many, many miles of filter strips in the Henrietta bottoms in Ray County that they were seeing. Their ditches were just getting silted in, which of course that was all compounded by the flooding, but we're wanting to be a little bit more proactive. And so we're putting a lot of switchgrass and wild rye in some buffers along there. But yeah, these natural disasters, if we call them that, are really natural events. And so they can be good teachers. And I really hope to see that. I would much prefer that than having to continuously bail out, failed crops. And so, which is a long discussion we could have there, but yeah, I think so. And I think up along the Missouri River up towards Northwest, I'd be interested to see some of the sign up numbers. I haven't looked into it, but yeah, I think so.
So I'm going to jump in because we worked fairly closely with some other wildlife conservation and resources conservation groups to provide a report to the Governor Parsons' recent Flood Recovery Advisory Working Group, acronym FROG. And so we saw kind of a lot of that process of the policy level decision making and information gathering that went into talking about this issue and dealing with flood resilience. Unfortunately, a lot of the policy recommendations that the official group came up with were more levies, essentially, which we, given the question that the person asked, the massive flooding in 2011 and 2019, our levee systems did not stop those things. But one of the more heartening things that I saw was a partnership between some researchers and some natural resources conservation groups and the Atchison County levee district. The gentleman from that levee district gave a really excellent presentation where he very much advocated for implementing more of these wetland practices, especially along the large river systems, and essentially recreating a floodplain that would act as Ethan D said earlier, as a sponge that would take up this water, because this water has to go somewhere. And I think that Ethan or Zeb, I think you guys know, the NRCS USDA gets many times more applications for wetland restoration projects than they're able to fund. I think it's more than 10 to 1 in terms of cost of proposed projects versus what they are able to fund each year. So this is a really interesting policy issue, because really there are a lot more producers that are demanding these sort of natural flooding resilience solutions than are able to be helped, even with all of the programs that are in place on both the public level and then the private level that Tyler and Ethan work on.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
The email that we were discussing, wasn't it like there's $10 million in funding and $147 million worth of applications? So that's
just for WREP,
just for
one of the enrollment programs.
So I can't say much about prairie strips, but I mean, the buffers that were brought up earlier in the presentation, we did see those firsthand. Up along in northeastern Missouri, we were doing a quail study and private lands, and it was amazing. These guys had just amazing 100-foot buffers around all their fields, and it was, I think their impetus there was not so much getting money to do a practice. I think they truly loved their heritage of having quail and wildlife, and so they did it. A lot of historically, I think a lot of these practices, whether it's flooding or other types of things that affecting enrollment and people doing these practices, often have an attachment more closely related to commodities than maybe values or long-term economic planning. But at least this last year, I haven't really. I just know that there's a lot of farmers that were absolutely devastated this last year. And since our wetland program stepped back a bunch, I haven't had a chance to reach out to a lot of them. The last week or 2 weeks ago, I was talking to one of our wetland landowners, and he's just still working hard trying to clean up his property. Some people lost, 2,000 acres of 3,000 acres if they're close to the river. And, these people came to those meetings trying to deal with things like, what should we do? What are the plans? And Dana mentioned the frog meeting, and they mentioned all these resilient plans. They had experts from watersheds. You had great levee district people there. And they weren't even really fighting. They were just saying, no, really, levees aren't really going to do it. And really this thing called climate change is a real thing. And maybe we need some of these practices like levee setbacks and buffers and strips. And, then the political plan came out that was just like mentioned levees 30 some times and never mentioned climate change once. So I think the solutions will be in private landowners. I think that's an excellent question, because I think more people are aware of that. They want to save their farms. They want to save their land. They want to do it.
Yep, I think that covers it. I was going to echo the same thing when I worked in one of the WETS offices for a little bit, and it was a lot of I think if I remember right, after flood events, we would get more calls, and then there'd be a lot of well, we have this many signups and this many applications, so we can only get a few of them done. So that's how it is. But yes, people are definitely concerned about this and would like to do these if there's money available, but they are really expensive practices to implement, especially on your own, especially if you're going to offset a potential crop field. So there are a lot of challenges to doing it, but hopefully we'll get there.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of Tylers out there. There's a lot of good Ethans out there that are helping deliver all these really good programs. And I think one of the only things that are holding them back is there isn't more funding available. And these things are saving money in the long run. And so I hope in the future more people support their types of programs, whether it's just through joining their chapters or advocating for good policy that supports more funding for what they do, because they are saving money for everybody in the long run, and they're improving life for everybody. So yeah, so thank you guys for being here. We really appreciate you.
Yeah, this is great. I really love the opportunity to come on. Thanks for the great plug. Yeah, pitch in however you guys can. On our Missouri PFQF website, we have all the chapter locations, and it's a great way to get involved with your community too. You know, a lot of it is just building community first and fundraising second. And so check us out. I think you could enjoy yourself.
I'll second that, except for NWTF, and even better, just like Ethan D said, just, if you could support both of us or organizations or one or the other, and either not, even if you don't, just, feel free to talk to us, and we're here to help you guys with information and anything we can do. If you have a lot of property, a little property, either way. Me and Ethan both get really excited whenever we get new habitat projects, and we work close together. So it's a nice partnership between just us two, and again, appreciate you guys having us on. So.
We're so glad you guys could make it. Again, you guys know a lot more about all of the actual behind the scenes for a lot of this stuff than we do, so we're really appreciative. My one note I was gonna say, I just added their Missouri PFQF and National Wild Turkey Federation to the chat. I don't know if I mentioned it earlier, but we record these and it will be going up on YouTube and our website, so you don't have to try and frantically click all of the links I put on here. I'll put those in our video description when they're hosted later. So that's all I've got. If anybody else has any other closing remarks, feel free to do so. All right, I'm seeing everybody shake their heads, and we'll start the waving, and thanks everybody for attending.
Thank you guys.
See you next time.